Hey, what's up everybody? I hope you're ready for a bit of a self-indulgent video because I've decided to make a little retrospective where I go through each of the short videos in the Number series and talk a little bit about the process and some of my inspirations and motivations for each video. I probably won't be making any more videos like these, at least for a while, so I think it's a good time to do a little retrospective like this to sort of mark the end of this project. So, a little bit of background about this project because I didn't really talk much about it. I came up with it as a way to practice a bunch of things simultaneously. So if you didn't know from reading my Instagram posts, each of these videos is based off of a chord progression in the NeoSoul PDF package from jazzlessonvideos.com. In this package there's basically 21 different chord progressions along with examples of one- and two-handed chord voicings and a nice little jazzy example phrase that you can play over the progression. And it also comes with really awesome backing tracks. So when I started this project, I had a really specific goal, which was to learn the fancy jazz line, learn all of the keyboard voicings, and then do my best to replicate the drum and bass parts from the backing track on my own instruments. I also wanted to turn it into a bit of a writing exercise as well, by adding my own horn parts and also a vocal melody and some lyrics. And on top of that, I also wanted to practice some improvised soloing over the chord progression. I also got a lot of practice using Ableton Live and DaVinci Resolve since I had to record everything and put together the video. So basically, yeah, I just really wanted to get my money's worth out of this PDF package that I bought, and this project was the best way that I could think to do that since I would be practicing a variety of different skill sets like writing and soloing and recording and editing and mixing. Not to mention like actually practicing on all the different instruments that I had to record in those videos. Okay, so first up is number one. Now this is obviously the first one that I ever made, so I guess it's no surprise that I don't like it nearly as much as some of the other ones. The video presentation is nowhere near what it ended up being, and while I generally like the writing and some other individual aspects of this one, I don't think it holds up as much as some of the other ones that I've done. Part of this is because for the first several videos, I was trying to stick pretty hard to the original goals that I set for myself, and I followed the rules that I came up with like super literally. So you know, we have our little vocal melody, and then we have that fancy jazz line, and then we have me soloing over some pads that I wrote to outline the chords. I definitely like some individual aspects of this, but I don't think that it's anything particularly special. This is pretty special. This is the only video where I actually bothered to learn the fancy jazz line on the keyboard, and then after that I was like, nah, it's too hard. I'm not really trying to be an incredible piano player or anything. I'm mostly just trying to learn about harmony and stuff. It's also the only one where I did a fade out for the end, which was maybe a little lazy, but that's okay. I guess you gotta start somewhere, right? And I remember one of the big challenges for this one was writing a vocoder melody that sort of worked with the chromatic, non-functional harmony sort of chord progression. And by the way, I'd really love to talk more about the harmony in these videos, but I also don't want to step on the toes of the people that created this PDF package, so I'm going to have to refrain from getting too specific about like what the chords are and what the harmony is. If you're interested in that source material, I'd say that you should go to jazzlessonvideos.com and just get the PDF. In fact, I have that linked in the description. So yeah, anyway, this one's not one of my favorites, but I think things get a little bit better from here on out, so yeah, let's check out the next one. So unlike the first one, I actually still kind of like this one, even though it's still kind of formulaic and that it really like sticks to the goals that I set out for myself. That ends up being less of a thing in the later videos, as you'll see, but yeah, I think that the flute intro is still pretty cool, and I also think that I did a better job with the vocoder on this, though I still have a long way to go with it, even now, like as I'm making this video. The lyrics, which I know a lot of people have trouble understanding through the vocoder, they're about that semi-conscious sort of dream state that you experience when you're sleeping in and you're sort of drifting out from one dream to the next. It's also a bit of a middle finger to that social media like grind culture that says that you need to like wake up at 4 in the morning to be productive, and I'm not really about that. So yeah, a funny thing about this one, and also kind of an embarrassing thing about this one, is that I was still kind of figuring out my camera situation And for some reason, I thought it would be a good idea to screen record my iPad using QuickTime on my laptop. That was before I got like a webcam, and I think for the first one I used my laptop camera, and it was just kind of hard to like position the laptop in a way that made it look good, as you can definitely see. And the iPad was like a little bit of a step up, but it was not much better. I'm not one to care too much about visual aesthetics, but man, that one's that one's bad even for me with those yellow rectangles and the camera going in and out of focus. Yeah, so at this point though, I was trying to keep my momentum up and not like stall out on the smaller details. And for me, that's a bigger priority than, you know, finding a great camera or whatever. So yeah. For number 3, I was already getting pretty tired of the form that I introduced for the first two, so I tried to shake this one up a little bit by bringing the vocal melody back in the last part and then really trying to change things up the last time through the form. I also wanted to do something on the clarinet that was a little bit more complex than just holding some long notes for pads. I ended up recording that full fancy jazz line on alto, new rad, clarinet, and piccolo, and then I just kind of split up the phrase between those 4 instruments. So yeah, I kind of wanted the phrase to start on what for me are like relatively normal instruments, and then end up on some stranger instruments that my Instagram followers might not necessarily expect from me. That way it kind of goes with the lyrics, which are just kind of about life being weird and inexplicable and kind of uncomfortable. Something that I'm sure a lot of us have experienced in the past year or so. When the words come around the second time, the lyrics change a little, becoming, you know, I go crazy every day, which sort of prompts the dramatic shift from a relatively acoustic vibe to a totally electric vibe in the very end. This is also the only video where I ever sing without using the vocoder, and I'm not at all comfortable with singing. Which is partly why my voice is so heavily processed, but I needed like a vocal texture that was different from the one that the vocoder provided to like sort of foreshadow a more dramatic change, if that makes sense. I always wish that I was a good singer, but I sort of feel like it's one too many things for me to practice at this point. Anyway, I had a lot of fun doing the little like breath-controlled keyboard thing at the end. Basically, I just took one of the serum patches that I got from the Art of Wind synth, and I made it polyphonic. And then I changed the range of the synthesizer in Ableton using the instrument rack so that it ignores the super low C sharp that you get from playing iwi with no hands. And it's pretty easy to set up, but if I get enough interest, then maybe I can do a little video tutorial. So after I put number 3 on Facebook and Instagram, one of my friends reached out to me and basically said, hey, these videos are super cool and everything, but your drums, they sound really flat and they're not really interesting to listen to. So he sent me some YouTube tutorials on drum mixing, and to be honest, I'm not sure if they made my drums sound any better, but it definitely got me thinking of ways to put a little bit more character into the stock drum sounds that I'm using from Ableton. I don't know much about mixing music at all. Right now my goal is sort of just to make everything audible. And if I can make it sound kind of good, then that's like an added bonus. It's something that I do want to get good at though, and so hopefully the classes that I'm going to be taking in September will help with that. So here's number 4. This is another one that I'm not a huge fan of, but to be fair, I also found it pretty difficult to create. The chord progression is only 3 chords long, but the way that the harmony moves is kind of bizarre to my ears, even still. It was especially hard to navigate when I was writing the vocoder melody, which in general I'm not super satisfied with, although I do think that the call and response thing I have going on is like kind of decent. I think the vocoder might sound a little bit better in a lower octave with like a bit of a slower vibrato. I feel like right now it's got like a bit too much of like a goat vibe going on. So compositionally, I was sort of going for like a Moonchild type thing between the vocal melody and the flutes. But you might not know it from listening to it, especially since the rest of the track is like not very Moonchild-like. And that's at least in part because I was trying to copy the groove from the backing track. I do like the new rad solo that I played. It actually ended up working pretty well going into the fancy jazz line, which I also played on alto and flute, of course. I ended this one with like a sort of reharm of the progression that I played on the horns as sort of a soli type thing, since I wanted to get away from just like doing long note pad stuff. Although I guess this solo is not super different. But yeah, for when I was writing that, I sort of just like played through the progression a couple different ways that I could think of and just tried to like follow my ear as it was telling me like what chord to go from to the next, and then put that in the horn section. So that was sort of the process for that. I guess for this one I also figured out how to put my initials on the launch pad, which is pretty cool. I forget what Max for Live device I use for that, but I'll like put it over here or something. Speaking of the Launchpad though, man, that thing is super hard to play. It's a Novation Launchpad Mark II, and it has really good functionality when paired with Ableton, but I feel like I have to hit the pads just so hard to get a response out of them. And to be honest, it like kind of hurts my fingers. Like I can only use my pointer finger and my middle finger to play those. If I use any of my other fingers, then like it starts to hurt my joints pretty fast, which is not ideal. So this sort of influenced how I actually have the pads set up for this video, and also for number 5. Basically I have 2 hi-hats, 2 snares, and 2 bass drums, so that I sort of have one set per hand, and then I kind of just alternate sides every 16th note. This makes it a little bit easier to play faster subdivisions on the pads without like totally wearing out your fingers or your wrist. It was pretty fun to set this up and experiment with this and like learn it and kind of learn how to play the drum pads, but it was also probably way more trouble than it was worth. In my later videos I kind of got away from using the drum pad, which is probably for the better, but it was pretty fun while it lasted. I might bring it back just to practice coordination and rhythm, but I feel like for now at least the novelty has worn off for me. So number 5 is where I start kind of getting into the groove of this project, and that's for sure because I'm like breaking away from following my own rules so strictly. And it's for this reason that number 5 is one of my favorites. I also sort of established the video format that I really like with the soft corners and the colors. I also start to be really strict about showing every instrument that's being played at once, including some harmony stuff that I might have left out in previous videos. But yeah, this is the first video where I decided to leave out the fancy jazz line that gets included with each chord progression. To be honest, I feel like it was a little bit too jazzy for what I was creating, and I didn't think all of that chromaticism that tends to show up in these lines really fit in with the smooth jazz, like R&B, slow jam vibe that I was kind of going for. For this one, I also completely rewrote the bass part, and I changed a bunch of the bass notes around. And as a result, that of course like changed the rest of the harmony too, and it felt really good to finally break out of my own rule set just a little bit. Honestly, I kind of wish that I had done that for the drums as well, because I was still very much trying to copy the backing track recording for this one, and I think the drums don't really need to be that busy. Other than that though, I'm like really proud of this one. It was a lot of fun to really shamelessly chase down that smooth jazz vibe. I'm actually a bit of a fan of smooth jazz. For this one I was really trying to channel Dwayne Kerr in the flute solo and Everett Harp in that little sax solo thing at the end. These are 2 of my smooth jazz heroes for sure. My favorite things in the video is the little quarter note delay on the lead synth in the beginning, and the resolution of the dominant 7 flat 13 sharp 9 chord in the flute and synth trio that happens at the end of the vocal melody. I'm going to play that last one for you in isolation. So now that I've really broken my rules with number 5, I break them even more with number 6. The original chord progression in the PDF is 5 bars long, and it's minor 11 chords descending in minor thirds and then resolving to a major chord. And as cool as that was, I didn't really vibe with it, so instead I just repeated each bar twice, and then I scrapped the resolution to the major chord, thereby making it a symmetrical pattern. Of course, once I changed all that, the cool fancy jazz line didn't fit in either, so I scrapped that as well. And then I kind of just didn't really bother to lift the drum and bass parts off the recording, because at this point I sort of had like a Robert Glasper hip-hop vibe that I was going for anyway. I've always been really intrigued by the concept of rhythmic displacement, and just sort of having like an identical part happen again, but in a different part of the bar. So I tried that with the bass line by having it start a 16th note earlier every second time, instead of having it start on a downbeat every time. So that was fun to experiment with, and I also thought this would be a good one to experiment with controlling some ambient textures with the NuRad. So on the left, I'm playing random notes through a MIDI note repeater, and the NuRad on the right is playing a single note through 3 different arpeggiators that are then playing ascending fifths at various speeds. I EQ'd out everything under around 3 kHz, so that we're left with this sort of like high sparkly texture. And then I'm using the pitch bend plates to sort of make that texture fit loosely in the chord. And that sounds kind of like this. So at this point, I sort of got like a pretty consistent strategy when it came to like starting this project each time over from the beginning. And that was like I would learn the keyboard part, and then when it came to actually writing the melody, I would sort of just write what the harmony seemed to suggest to me. And I would try to write a melody around the natural chord movement that happens within the voicings. So the melody always ends up being really influenced by the voicings that I learned as part of this project. So yeah, anyway, for number 7, I definitely got like sort of a video game cutscene or like anime soundtrack type vibe. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to experiment with some new textures that I hadn't used before, like orchestral strings and clarinet quintet and soprano sax. I think I ended up changing the chords a lot for this one too, just to allow for each chord to have the C and the G as common tones, so that I could have that really simple but like pretty strong background part in the flutes and the pluck strings. So I'm really happy with this one because I sort of got to break some new ground genre-wise, which is a lot of fun. Number 8 is another one that I'm pretty proud of. In general, I'm more happy with the more recent ones, mostly because I made fewer compromises between what I wanted the music to be and the rules that I set out to follow originally. In this one, a big focus for me was trying to make the vocoder a little bit clearer and the words a little bit easier to understand. The criticism I got for most of the earlier videos was that the lyrics were impossible to make out, so for this one I tried to over-enunciate everything. And I also changed a bunch of the settings in my vocoder setup in Ableton, which definitely helped. I also ditched the bass clarinet for the bass line for this one, partly because I wanted a synthier sound, and partly because the bass part that I wanted was actually too low for my bass clarinet. Honestly, if I could sell that bass clarinet and get a contra alto, I would do that immediately. I also ditched the drum pad, and I did the drums mostly in the Reason drum sequencer, which I then recorded to their own tracks in Ableton so that I could make the drum part a little bit less sequenced and a little bit more interactive. I might have overdone it a little bit because it sounds a little bit busy to me now, but it was better than anything I could have done on the drum pad. So the other thing I did to make up for skipping the fancy jazz line in the past 2 videos was write a little 5-part soli around the jazz line in this one. So that was a lot of fun. And then I kind of changed the sound of that by running it through some chorus to give it a little bit of a distorted sound. So number 9 is it's the only one that I skipped, if you don't count the last 7. But yeah, the reason for that is because the chord progression is just a bunch of minor 11 chords moving up in half steps, and there's nothing wrong with that, of course, and it's a really cool sound, but I sort of wanted to take this project as an opportunity to explore some harmony that's a little bit more on the functional side. Or at least something a little bit more creative than just parallel harmony. So, next up is number 10, which is a lot of people's favorite video, and it's one that I'm also pretty happy with. The main inspiration for this one was a track called Flutter by an electronic music duo called Autechre. There's a really interesting story behind this track, as it was created by Autechre as a response to a law that the UK government tried to pass in 1994 that gave the police more power to crack down on gatherings on land in the open air of 20 or more people at which amplified music is being played, which I think basically just means raves. So the law specifically defined music as sounds wholly or predominantly characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. So, Autechre produced this track called Flutter, which is composed of 65 uniquely programmed sequences of beats played consecutively. The idea was that since the same sequence of beats never repeats, this track can be legally played at raves were this law to be passed. There's even a note in the liner notes that say, Flutter has been programmed in such a way that no bars contain identical beats and can therefore be played under the proposed new law. However, we advise DJs to have a lawyer and a musicologist present at all times to confirm the non-repetitive nature of the music in the event of police harassment. Anyway, I always really liked this track and I was intrigued by the concept, so I made a drum beat that's 8 bars long, where no bar repeats itself exactly within those 8 bars. I did this using Reason's drum sequencer plugin, which is pretty good and I like it a lot, although I've since switched over to a drum sequencer plugin called Nerve by Expert Records that I think is a lot better. I think that Reason's plugin is really good if you're using it inside Reason, but if you're using it in Ableton, then it loses some of its functionality, and therefore I think Nerve is a bit of a better substitute. Also, I like the way that you can write velocity better on Nerve, so anyway. Another artist that inspired the sound of this one is a pianist called John Camille Farah, who's a really incredible musician and also a fellow Canadian. His music is a super cool mix of contemporary classical and electronic music, and I was sort of thinking of him and also maybe a little bit of Hiromi Uhara when I was coming up with the piano part. So obviously I'm not a virtuoso piano player like either of them, but I kind of tried to fake it by using an arpeggiator, and what was cool about that was that I had some voicings that were 6 notes and some voicings that were 5 notes, and of course when you run those different numbers of notes through the arpeggiator, it comes out having like a different rhythmic total, so it adds I think a lot of rhythmic interest to that piano part. I also took this one as an opportunity to show off some of the capabilities of my new rad setup. So at the beginning of that solo, I'm using the lit plate to change the glide rate to give it sort of like a smeary, dramatic rise. And I do that at the end of the solo too, and then I use the motion controls to activate a tremolo effect. So number 11 is a lot simpler than number 10, and to be honest, I didn't really have any specific inspirations for this one. My thought process for this was basically, I want to do another 5-part soli, and also I haven't practiced the clarinet in a while, so that's why there's a 5-part soli with 3 clarinets in it. And the soli is of course written around the fancy jazz line, but before I actually play the whole thing in its entirety, I thought it would be cool to do sort of a chopped up remix version of it. I've always been like pretty interested in creating music out of like, you know, samples and chopping up other people's music, and I think that's a really cool and valid way to perform and compose music that I don't really do because I just write it all from scratch. I think that making music using samples is, you know, really cool. A lot of my favorite music is made that way. So I kind of wanted to experiment with that a little bit, even if it was just chopping up something that I had already recorded. This one was actually a huge challenge for me, but I'm pretty happy with the way that it turned out overall. Doing the video for this one was also a big challenge, and honestly I got a little bit burnt out from all the effort that I was putting into editing a million video files on like my sad little laptop. Another focus of mine for this one was really copying the drum feel from the backing tracks. I'd actually kind of been ignoring the backing tracks for the past several videos since I already had like a pretty solid idea of what I wanted the vibe and the parts to be like, but I'm really glad that I checked out this one because it was really interesting to hear how the drums fit into the click track. I think that rhythm and beat placement in general is something that I could stand to look into a lot more, so I'm glad that I did it for this video. Number 12 was another one that was super fun to make, although I sort of feel like the final product didn't really match up to my ambitions. And I think this is partly or even mostly due to my lack of experience when it comes to mixing. There are times in this composition where there are up to 19 individual parts happening at once, which was just like a little bit hard for me to manage. One of my focuses for this one was to write some cool vocal harmonies, something sort of a little bit like George Duke stuff. This is another one where I really changed around the chord progression. In fact, I think that this one might be the one that's furthest from the actual source material. I really like the fact that it ended up being a 10-bar long form, and I actually really like it when forms don't end up being just a power of 2. And that's something that I really want to experiment with more in the future. Another thing that I tried to do was use one of the piano voicings in the flute solo, which is a really cool sound, and it's a great way to build some interesting vocabulary on single note instruments. I also did that for number 7 in the soprano sax solo. Alright, so I'm really stoked to talk about this next one. Number 13 is by far my favorite out of all of them, and there's a lot of different inspirations that went into it. This one was also really challenging at first. I remember I learned the chord progression from the book, and I thought that it sounded really sad and depressing. And this might be partly because when I learn something on the keyboard, I have to play it like super slowly while I'm learning it, so it kind of gives everything like a funeral vibe. I also think that the dominant 7 flat 13 chord resolving up a half step to the major 7 chord is just like a genuinely haunting sound. And it was kind of that haunting sound that inspired the lyrics, which also sort of reflected how I was feeling at the time. Before I wrote the lyrics, I actually wrote that little horn solo part, and I was actually stuck on this one for like several days. Eventually enough time went by that I was like, okay, I have to write literally anything over this. So I came up with that little descending melody based on the chord voicings, as I like to do, and then that eventually also became the vocal melody. But I really tried to change the phrasing of the vocal melody and really contrast it with the like super staccato, almost pompous vibe that the woodwind solo had. I think it was after that that I came up with the string part, which I decided should outline the chords in an ascending pattern, since the chord progression and the melody were all sort of headed in this downward direction, so I wanted to contrast that as well. A big inspiration for this track actually comes from the soundtrack of Fire Emblem Three Houses, which is an interesting soundtrack because it sort of blends the typical orchestral music score that Fire Emblem games are likely to have with sort of like an electronic or EDM sort of vibe. So that's kind of where the beat came from for this one. I think it was after I added the beat to it that I decided I should also add that kind of ridiculous harpsichord patch to the woodwind solo, which is, in my mind, it's a bit of a callback to the harpsichord sound in the Eminem track, The Real Slim Shady. So yeah, a lot of weird and disparate inspirations for this one. For the saxophone solo, I was really trying to channel Braxton Cook, who is definitely one of my favorite alto players and just musicians in general. I think one of the things that I like about this one is that I was able to take a harmonic progression that at first sounded really sad to me and turn it into a piece of music that has a lot of other emotions and attitudes represented as well. So the last one, at least for now, but possibly forever, is number 14. This one was partly about wrapping up loose ends for me, but I also wanted to write something that felt like an ending. So here are some of the loose ends that I wanted to deal with. I wanted to write something else in 3/4 since it's a really great time signature. I also wanted to finally use the soprano, alto, and tenor recorders that belong to my parents, since they're really unique instruments and lend such a unique and interesting texture to the music. Speaking of textures, I also wanted to do another clarinet quintet thing, since that's one of my favorite sounds. Another thing I'd been wanting to do was use the Respiro plugin. It's really awesome, but I never seem to get the opportunity to use it since I'm usually looking for sounds that are really explicitly synthy. But I think that Respiro really fits in well with all of the other acoustic instruments that I used in this one, and that sort of like organic acoustic vibe that I was going for. Lastly, I also wanted to use the Nerve drum sequencer plugin, which is, as I stated earlier, a big improvement on the drum sequencer for Reason that I used in all of my other videos. It plays a really small part in this video, but I think the way that it handles velocity data really adds a lot to the track. I like how I ended the track with the piano, which is just a little bit backwards from how I tend to do the rest of the videos, but I think that it adds sort of a nice symmetry to the project as a whole. After all, the main goal of the project was to learn more piano and get familiar with some cool voicings and harmonies, so I think that it's pretty fitting to end with solo piano. So that's it for these videos. I don't think I'll ever make any more, but who knows? I'm definitely done for now though, and I'm looking forward to making some different stuff. Maybe something that's completely original and completely my own creation. This was a really fun project though, and even though not every video turned out super good, I definitely learned a lot about writing and harmony and recording and even a little bit of production stuff, although I'm still not going to be calling myself a producer anytime soon. I think I'll probably just go through the rest of the book and use it to work on my piano skills, but maybe I won't worry so much about writing all sorts of different parts to it. As always, thank you for listening. I really appreciate your support in going through this journey with me, and yeah, until next time.